This is the Bob Zadek Show on Talk 910, San Francisco's talk station.
I got a star on my car and one on my chest, a gun on my hip and the right to arrest. I'm the guy who's a boss on this highway, so watch out what you're doing when you're driving my way. If you break
in your book, you trace the very interesting history of the militarization of police forces and, as you say, as a title, the rise of the warrior cop. You trace it back to the SWAT teams in the 60s and Daryl Gates in Los Angeles as the first time that police, well, maybe not the first time, but as an early example and one that gave momentum to the police forces starting to adopt military as opposed to police tactics. Tell us about how Daryl Gates and Watts gave birth to the SWAT teams and military tactics.
Yeah, so Gates was in charge of LAPD's response to the Watts riots in 1965, and Gates. These were unlike any riots we had ever seen before in the U.S. They were, they weren't isolated to one part of the city. They would spring up and sort of burn out for days. There were incidents where paramedics would respond to a scene where somebody had been hurt, and snipers would shoot at the paramedics, or they would shoot at firefighters. And so Gates likened this to a kind of urban guerrilla warfare and thought that LAPD needed a stronger response because, of course, this is a time in U.S. history where it would be reasonable to, assume that there were going to be more of these kinds of uprisings. So Gates came up with this idea of, well, if this is a type of warfare, then we need to respond, have a military-type response. So he worked with some Marines at Camp Pendleton and came up with this idea of assembling this very elite team of police officers that would be trained in military tactics. So you'd have an anti-sniper guy, you'd have a sniper, you'd have somebody who could breach entryways and force their way into buildings. And you'd have this team that would basically use overwhelming force and violence to diffuse an already violent scenario where you had lives at immediate risk.
And that made sense, didn't it? It made sense.
Sure, it did make sense. And even today, I think there are appropriate times and uses for SWAT teams. And responding to riots and active shooters and bank robberies. These are all, I think, appropriate uses. And in all of these cases, again, you're using violence, to quell a situation that has already gotten violent, where you have lives at risk, where somebody is in the process or will imminently be in the process of committing a violent crime. That's when this kind of force, does make some sense. And so there are a couple of high-profile SWAT raids on the Black Panther holdout and the Symbionese Liberation Army that get televised. It sort of vaults the SWAT concept into the popular culture. And by 1975, 5 years after the first SWAT team or 6 years, I guess, after the first SWAT raid in America, there are 500 SWAT teams across the country. And it spreads. But, up until about the early 80s, SWAT teams are still reserved for these emergency sorts of situations. They're still used sparingly and as a last resort. And it's really during the 80s and the Reagan administration that we start to see them used for much more routine policing, mainly to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes.
Now, that's what you just said is, as of course you emphasize in the book, it's really important, especially to a libertarian audience, because when you mention the Reagan administration and the Nixon administration before it, as you point out in the book, it was when the influence of Nixon's and then Reagan's war on drugs. War. Now, the word war, of course, is interesting because the rise of the warrior cop, war and warrior are not coincidental. So, as you point out in the book, and that was an eye-opener for me, the first step was the federal government, which of course knew during Prohibition that they could not enforce federal prohibition laws. They didn't have the manpower. There was no federal police force. Therefore, enforcement of prohibition could only work if the federal government could get the cooperation of the manpower of local police forces. And of course, it never really worked 100%. So the enforcement of prohibition was with scattered success. But Nixon and Reagan knew they had to somehow, because they didn't have their own police force to enforce drug laws, they had to somehow find a way to marshal local police forces to enforce federal law, in effect, become a surrogate federal force. And that is what you trace in the book so well, starting with Nixon.